You're taking me back to the sleepless nights, phone calls and candlelights. Those were the things I liked the most. And back when we were passing notes in school, spend our summers by the pool, talking about what we'd be when we're grown. Well, those were the days. You're taking me back. You're taking me back when the world was smaller and everything was ours. You're taking me back. You're taking me back when everything moves slower. You're taking me back to better days.
Okay, everybody, let's talk faith and science in the collide of the two. You know, Christian spirituality, mature Christian spirituality, should never ever negate somebody's intelligence. No, I think it should actually compel and attract somebody's intelligence. Mature Christian spirituality should never put a faith-filled person in a binary position where they have to choose actual science and their heartfelt faith. It should never put a person in a position where they have to choose somebody's interpretation and version of the truth over what's actually true. And yet, when you look at the current trend and what is going on in the kind of Christianity that is so prevalent in the West and in the United States, there seems to be a big portion of Christianity that is choosing doctrinal absolutism. It's choosing Christian ideology, Christianism, over what's actually true. And when you look at the statistics, when you look at the polls, it is sending a whole generation of people away from the church and from Christian spirituality because they're saying, I can't be part of a faith system that will actually choose and promote some version of the truth over what's actually true. Did you know there was a time in Christian history, you'd never know it today, but did you know that there was a time in Christian history where the church was actually the leader in scientific advancement? They were the actual leaders in it. There is obviously a large portion of 20th century American Christianity that has denied evolution, denied global warming, is not willing to confront the reality of imperialism and colonialism and its effects on marginalizing people and racism. There's a large part of the Christian church that has a phobia about gender science, about sexuality, and things like that. And it is just sending a large portion of thinking people, of sense-making people, away from a Christian spirituality that should be able to make room for intelligence, room for what's actually true. And we have to certainly bear a history of that, and bear a history where the church actually held heretical trials for scientists, Galileo being one of them, when he discovered that it's actually the earth that revolves around the sun. They actually called him a heretic, and the church held a trial because he went against their version of their tradition and their version of the Bible. And so this is true. And, you know, there are many who look back on that time in the Middle Ages and go, you know, maybe it was less about a scientific denial, and it was more about a church ego and a papal ego that wasn't willing to let go of tradition, and it wasn't willing to let go of their version of the truth. Jesus ran into it too. In Luke 11, the last half of Luke 11 is all about this. Jesus is invited over to a religious expert's house, a religious leader's house. And this religious leader knows the Bible back and forth. And right from the beginning of the dinner, Jesus offends this guy because this guy's version of the Bible, he goes, there's a certain way according to the Bible and the version of his faith that one needs to clean up before supper. And Jesus just comes to the dinner and he doesn't do it. And the guy is completely offended by it. And it's almost in that conversation that Jesus is having with this guy. He goes, you know, you Bible experts are so careful to make sure all the external things are pristine, all the external things are in order, and yet you're missing that faith is an internal thing. It's an internal thing of the heart, and you guys just aren't getting that. And Jesus just is insisting that faith is also a hard thing. In fact, he walks this guy through what's called the 6 woes, 6 things where this guy's mind and heart just aren't getting it. And finally, on the 6th one, Jesus says this to this guy: "You're hopeless, you Bible experts. You have taken away the key to learning about God. You yourselves would not learn, and you stopped others from learning too." Jesus gives this guy, this Bible expert, this biblicistic literalist, he gives him a tough thing to confront. It's like he's saying, you've emphasized so much of your version of right biblical knowledge, right biblical belief, correct practice, and you have actually robbed the people of their ability to learn. You've emphasized so much the right beliefs and the right doctrine that you've completely shut down people's minds and hearts to actually learn more. And so, folks, this is what religious fundamentalism does. This is what biblicism and literalism does. When it has an approach of, this is what the Bible says, this is what we believe, and to be a good Christian, you have to believe what we believe, and you have to hold this doctrine. It literally shuts down one's mind and intelligence and their heart discovery. Listen, up to the French Revolution, the Catholic Church was the leading sponsor of academics and scientific advancement. In fact, it was the church who would pay priests and pay monks to actually go to universities to study and to learn more. The church insisted that science and mathematics be compulsory in learning as much as it would be to theology. And it was the Christian church that very much accepted Greek and Arabic philosophers. The Apostle Paul, you could tell he was a fan of Aristotle and the way he would think. in the 17th century. Do you know who became the leading scientific organization in Europe? It was the Jesuit order of priests. They published thousands of academic papers. They spread new discoveries around the world. The cathedrals they designed also doubled as astronomical observation places. And of course, modern genetics was founded by the future abbot Gregor Mendel, who was growing peas in his monastic garden. Folks, to study the natural world, to discover what is true about the natural world, is to actually admire the work of God all around us. And the church was leading in that at one point. This is why many young people who consider themselves Christians are big fans of green issues. For them, it is a spiritual issue to look at the natural world, to look at the world around it, and to understand it, to study it, and to actually even care for them, to care for it. It was the Christian faith of Copernicus that led him to turn away from the ugly Ptolemaic version of the universe. It was the faith of Kepler that had him discover the constitution of the solar system. It was the faith of scientist James Clerk Maxwell, when he took electromagnetism and he reduced it down to equations that just took the science community's breath away. One scientist was Albert Einstein. Maxwell inspired Einstein, but it was the faith of Maxwell that inspired him to advance his intellect that way. But then we get to the 16th century, and two things are going on: the Enlightenment and the Protestant Reformation. And here is where the beginning of science and faith clashing. And so what was happening as the Enlightenment happened, which was all about rationale and reason, it was a reaction. The Enlightenment was a reaction to two things: advancement in science, of course, but it was also a reaction to Catholic fundamentalism that was going on, that the church held control of all of these things. And so people started to understand maybe reason and rationale. Maybe there are other ways of looking at the things. And what happened was the Catholic Church, as well as the beginning of the Protestant Church, felt that was a threat to what they believe. Oh my gosh, if people turn away from God because they now believe in science, we now need to make faith rational. So this is where the Protestants emphasized everything on the Bible. The Bible will now give us a reason and an answer for everything. So just as the church reacted and feared the rationalism of the Enlightenment, they then went on to create biblical rationalism. They did the exact same thing, just now saying the Bible is the reason. And thus began the clash of science and faith. By the time we get to the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, much of American Christian fundamentalism and evangelicalism, it certainly embraced anti-intellectualism. And so I just want to continue to hold to the hope that I think that both theology and science can be at least two of the most powerful intellectual sources that exist in the world today. But that isn't going to come about by theological fundamentalism denying science, and it's not going to come about unless faith and science work together, and faith has a more open and evolving heart. And this is why it is so important for Christian spirituality to have an important understanding of the natural world and to have an important understanding of human nature and how it works. This is why Christian spirituality very much needs to make room for psychology and sociology and anthropology and neuroscience and biological science and ethics. This is why it is so important to understand this. And from our Christian perspective, those of us who hold on to our Christian faith, we believe that God broke through the natural world with the divine. But it's so important to hold the two together. And when you look at the scriptures with a thinking mind, not necessarily a literalistic or biblicistic mind, but when you look at the scriptures with a thinking mind, it just becomes obvious that the scriptures have evolved over time and our God understanding evolved with it. When you look at the scriptures, God becomes less violent, God becomes less punitive, God becomes less tribal, God becomes more inclusive, and you just see people's God understanding evolve over time. You know, the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, he gives a young pastor, a young minister named Timothy, a warning of when opposition comes to the mind and heart. Let me show you this. Timothy, protect what has been given to you in trust. Stay away from people who talk about useless things that are not from God and who argue against you with a knowledge that is not knowledge at all. Folks, people can become so drowned, so saturated in their beliefs, in their ideologies, whether they're religious, political, ideological, or whether they're just opinion. People can be so fixated on those things. They can even grow in knowledge of those things and gain more knowledge of those things, that what actually happens, they negate true knowledge. And that's what Paul is saying to Timothy. Listen, avoid people that start talking about things that aren't really reflecting the heart of God. And they may sound very clever and they may have knowledge upon knowledge, but it's not actual knowledge. So I love how the Living Translation puts this. Keep out of foolish arguments with those who boast of their knowledge, thus prove they lack it. When I started this series, If Faith Had a Brain, I said that I wanted to look at several scenarios from the Apostle Paul's life where he shows a great example how Christian spirituality ought to mean that we think well, that we're good thinkers. So we looked at when Paul showed up at Thessalonica, and we kind of showed that good thinking always means you confront your biases, you confront your preconceived conclusions. Then we looked at when Paul showed up at Berea in Athens, and we said, good thinking means that you open your heart to new ideas, you open your mind to new ideas, and you're willing to leave fixed ideas that just don't make sense anymore. Well, after Paul leaves Athens, he shows up in the town of Corinth, and finally his friends Silas and Timothy join him, and he goes again and reasons with the Jews in the synagogues, and he even talks to the Greek Gentiles about his own faith evolvement of where included in his Judaism is now his trust in Jesus, and that Jesus is his Messiah. So let me show you what happens in Corinth, and then let me show you one more aspect of what it means to think well. Let's read this. Each Sabbath found Paul at the synagogue trying to convince the Jews and the Gentiles alike. And after Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul spent all his time teaching and sharing. He testified to them that Jesus was the Messiah. But when they opposed and insulted him, Paul shook the dust from his clothes and said, "Your blood is upon your own heads. I'm innocent. From now on, I will go and preach to the Gentiles." Now, this is not a hothead who gives up just like that. This is a man who has endured opposition a lot and all the time and hung in there. One of the things I want to show from this passage that you see, this last aspect I want to share with you about thinking well. Folks, thinking well is hard work. Thinking well takes hard work. But don't give up on the hard work of thinking. That's the reality. Thinking well takes time. Thinking well takes discovery. Thinking well takes effort. You have to wrestle to think well. You have to confront your own inner stuff, your own baggage, your own patterns, your own unhealthiness, your own preconceived conclusions, at times your own arrogance. So to think well is hard. Alan Jacobs, in his book, How to Think, and I love this book, this is what he argues. We suffer a settled determination to avoid thinking. Relatively few people want to think. Thinking troubles us. Thinking tires us. Thinking can force us out of the familiar and confront unhealthy patterns. Thinking can actually complicate your life. It can set you at odds with the people you admire or love. Thinking can complicate our most meaningful relationships. Do you identify with some of that? Hello? When you started to think outside your faith box, when you started to evolve to a more progressive faith away from your conservative Protestantism or conservative Christianity or conservative evangelicalism, how did the people around you respond? Did they welcome it? Or did it create some distance? And this is, listen, thinking is hard, and you pay a price for it. And to Jacob's argument, this is why a lot of people aren't willing to do it. So really, who needs thinking, right? Because it's too hard to think. Just give me absolutes. Give me promises to claim. Give me truths to proclaim, because it all gives me certainty. It gives me a place to hide my doubts. But actually thinking does the opposite, right? It unsettles, it creates vagueness, it creates uncertainty, and actual thinking leaves things unresolved. But it is worth it. Don't give up on good thinking. So when it comes to faith and theology, hang in there. And don't give up the reality that your mind and heart can grow and that they can evolve. And give yourself permission to think outside the box. Give yourself the freedom to investigate and discover that there are others that are expanding new Christian theologies. As I often say, why does every other ology Why is every other ology able to expand and grow and open up, yet theology is supposed to be fixed? That just doesn't make any sense to me, and doesn't seem that would reflect the immense eternal heart of God. Didn't Jesus say, it's the truth that will set you free? And that Greek word for truth is the word aletheia. And aletheia doesn't mean truth as it's some doctrine. The word aletheia means what is actually true. Jesus is saying what is actually true is what will set you free. So real thinking, deep thinking is hard. And let's not be one of those when it comes to our Christian spirituality that we're not willing to do the hard work of thinking, even if the hard work confronts some things in our belief system that don't make any sense, or things in our belief system that need to change. There's something better than truth, and that is what's actually true. So I said I would circle around when Paul comes back in Corinth. So as I said, there are a group of biblicists and fundamentalists who are making trouble for Paul. And it continues. So let me show you a little later in the chapter. But just as Paul started to make his defense, Gallio, who was the governor in that region, turned to Paul's accusers and said, listen, if this were a case involving some wrongdoing or a serious crime, I would have a reason to accept your case. But since it's merely a question of words and names in your religious laws, take care of it yourselves. I refuse to judge such matters. And he threw them out of the courtroom, and the crowd then grabbed Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue, and they beat him right there in the courtroom. So yes, being willing to think in a way where you leave a belief system that others say is true, that takes hard work, absolutely. But it also means engaging your heart. So we've been talking a lot about the mind. But how I want to finally end this is about staying curious with your heart. But when you embrace spiritual mystery, oh my gosh, it makes God bigger. In fact, when you have to have a faith system that is about certainty and the right answers and right beliefs, you know what you and I end up doing? We end up creating a God who looks just like ourselves, which is a small God. But when you hold on to spiritual mystery in your heart, in your mind, doesn't have to have all these things certain, and your heart can live in the wonderful tension of this just makes God bigger. I want to share with you before we go 2 Hebrew words that you need to know. The first word is yesh. Do you know what yesh means? Yesh means isness. It means beingness. Yesh means something. It's all the things that matter. Even love is yesh. And so we live in a world of yesh. Yesh is not bad. Yesh is good. Yesh helps us name things and discover things. It helps us understand things. Yesh is something. Yesh is everything but one thing. Yesh is not the other Hebrew word I want you to know, which is ayin. So ayin is the opposite of yesh. Ayin is nothing, or ayin is nothingness. Ayin is without end. It literally means nothing with a capital N. And so God is part yesh. He's part something, absolutely. And we have terms where we can make God anamorphic. So we use terms and words and descriptions and illustrations to make God yesh, to make God something, so we can describe God and understand God. But God is more than something. God is also nothing. He is also defined by not defining him. That's apophatic theology. God is, but God is also not how you describe him. And so this is spiritual mystery. And when your heart can embrace spiritual mystery, it just expands your spiritual experience. You know, Richard Rohr talks about 4 aspects of embracing mystery, spiritual mystery, and gaining that experience. One of the things he says about spiritual, mysterious experiences, they just happen. You cannot contrive them. They just happen. You can go to many church services by their style of worship or how they certainly approach emotionalism or hyper-supernaturalism. The environments can become contrived. True spiritual experiences, I agree with Rohr, they just happen. You can't contrive them, you can't create them, they just come upon you. And you know it when you're in it. Your mind is grabbing it and your heart is grabbing it, right? They are also passively present. You don't have the experience has you. And it's just kind of this passive presence that you just experience. And then it's a mindful perception. You're understanding this experience. It makes sense. But then it's also ineffable. It's an ineffable experience. It's an experience that you cannot describe. Your mind can't describe it. Your words can't necessarily articulate it. You may try, but it's ineffable. Your heart knows it. Your heart is just experiencing it. And when your heart is experiencing that mystical experience, that wall, that veil of separation between you and the spiritual, you and God, it just begins to become a thin veil, or it falls away altogether. There is a togetherness you experience. There is a oneness that you experience. And it's not in your mind, it's in your being. It's in your presence. It's in your heart. So whatever makes spirituality spiritual, whatever makes Christian spirituality spiritual, it's about embracing mystery with your heart. And our answers are always trying to make sense of God in reasonable and rational ways. But that is to make God smaller. And there are many people who crash and burn. There are many people who have left biblicistic, evangelical, literalistic, biblicistic faith because God suddenly, giving God an answer and a reason for everything, suddenly made God rational, reasonable, but all of this made God small. And people, I think, are like, well, if I'm going to have a belief and trust in God, what's the point of having a small God? This God, this anti-intellectual God, this God in a box, this doctrinal God, this faith system God seems so small. And that's where I think Christian spirituality has just done a disservice. And we need to know that true, deep Christian spirituality can compel your intelligence and allow for mystery in your heart. and that we have a God that's a big God. And I think a growing number of people want to experience that. So Christian spirituality doesn't have to negate your intelligence. True Christian spirituality, you don't have to make a decision between actual science and a heartfelt faith. There's room for both. And deep Christian spirituality, in order to keep God big, cannot just be held in the reason and the rationale, in the answers of our mind, in the explanation of our mind. It's not just yesh, it's also ayin. We define God by not defining him. God is not just something, God is also nothing. And when you can make that mystery in your heart and allow for that spiritual mystery here, that veil of presence has the opportunity to now grow very thin, and you can experience God in present ways. Let's pray. God, I side with the frustration of those who have just said, I can't be part of a kind of Christianity that is anti-science, anti-intellectual, that just makes the intellect small. I wouldn't still be here if that were the case. But I believe that deep Christian spirituality never negates the intelligence, and it always compels it and expands it. I pray for my friends that if they're thinking of leaving faith, it wouldn't be because of that, and they would just know that comes from a certain sector of Christianity that embraces that. That is not the history of Christianity at all. And I pray that we all would not just have a faith in our head, but we would have a faith that's in our heart. A heart that makes room for spiritual mystery, so that the veil of presence between God and us could become very thin, and we could experience the presence of God in the uncertainty, in things unresolved, and that mystery would be the ironic comfort of hope. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
I don't know you, but I've seen the work of your hands, and I know, yeah, I know that you are good. I don't know you, but I've heard the love in your voice, and I know, yeah, I know that you are good. And I know that I have more than what I need, with the little, oh, the little that I know. I don't know you, but I felt the beat of your heart, and I know, yeah, I know that you are good. I don't know you, but I found this love in your eyes, and I know, yeah, I know that you are good. And I know that I have more than what I need, with a little, oh, the little that I know, yeah.
Okay, folks, before we go, those of you who are financially supporting SPERO DEI, thank you so much. And I want to let those of you who watch us each week or tune in to watch us, who are really resonating with SPERO DEI's message, the way we reimagine, rethink, and are reforming Christianity, if it is speaking to you, I just got to be honest with you, we need your support. So if this message means something to you, whatever you could give would be so meaningful, and it would just help us not only survive, but it would help keep our message going out. So it's really easy to give to SPERO DEI. It's really easy to become a recurring giver, SPERO DEI. Just go to SPERODEI.com, and in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see the word give, and you just tap on that, and it's as easy as buying something on Amazon, and it's as safe and secure as buying something on Amazon. So whether you want to give one time or sign up to be a recurring giver, where you give weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, quarterly, whatever you want, we would really appreciate it. So thank you very much, and peace, everybody. We'll see you next week.